I'm Taylor Fulkerson, a Jesuit from the Midwest United States. I'm here in Rome studying theology at the Gregorian University. For this episode, we're joined by Father Christopher Staub. Chris Staub, originally from Cleveland, Ohio, entered the Society of Jesus in 2005 in the former novitiate of the Detroit province in Berkeley, Michigan. Upon taking vows in 2007, Chris was sent to Lima, Peru for his studies in philosophy. He returned to the United States in 2011 and was missioned to Chicago, where he taught English and Spanish literature at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School in the Pilsen neighborhood for his regency. Chris completed his theology studies after in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, and was ordained a priest in 2017 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He has spent the last 5 years in Spain, completing his licentiate and doctorate degree in the area of Ignatian spirituality at Comillas University in Madrid. Now Chris finds himself in Rome, teaching classes in the area of Ignatian spirituality at the Gregorian University. Chris, welcome.
Thank you.
Do you remember what attracted you to the Society of Jesus in the beginning? What made you think maybe this Jesuit thing might be my thing?
So I had the opportunity when I was in high school. I went to a Jesuit high school in Cleveland, Ohio, St. Ignatius High School. And then I took, which was for a lot of us at the time, a kind of a traditional track, and I studied at a Jesuit university. So I was familiar with the Jesuits for a good part of my youth. But I think the piece of the Jesuit life that most attracted me was their capacity to kind of combine different aspects of life. So they could be fun, they could be serious, they could be prayerful, they could be engaged in culture. And that kind of a combination that they could sort of pull off in front of us when we were adolescents was very appealing. And then as I got to know them when I was a little older, it was they could do that in the church as well, and that could have sort of positive impact on people's lives. So that was enough, I could say, to get me in the door, so to speak, in the novitiate.
And the Spiritual Diary of St. Ignatius, do you remember how your interest in it began?
Right, so I did my thesis in Madrid on the diary, and I have to say that I'm a latecomer to the diary. So in the novitiate, Jesuit formation, even in theology, I'd never looked at the diary. So it was probably for me the surprise factor that most pulled me into the diary, which is to say I was unaware that this autographed text of Ignatius's even existed for the first 12 years of Jesuit life. And so my interest in it was this discovery, and then this discovery of this text written in this man's hand in which he recounts his experience of God.
In your experience, what generally surprises new readers about the diary?
Right, I think there are a couple of things. I think the first thing that surprises readers is that, and I suppose I say this playfully, but that it exists. So most of us Jesuits, a lot of Jesuits aren't aware that it exists. Number two, they're not, one of the things that's surprising about the diary is the simplicity with which it begins and the beauty with which it sort of ends. So it begins with a very simple question. Ignatius is asking God, should we accept this income for these churches? So it's a very simple question, it's a very mundane question, and it's because of the simplicity of that question that he enters into this, what we would call now, sort of this mystical journey with God. And so I think that's surprising for people that read it, to see that the journey into God's life actually begins with these very mundane, simple, quotidian questions that if we ask God about, perhaps they will lead us deeper into God's life.
You are about to start teaching at the Gregorian University here in Rome on Ignatian spirituality. What place does the Spiritual Diary have for you in this new world you're entering into?
Right. Well, I think it has a great place because it shows Ignatius writing his experience of prayer. It shows Ignatius struggling in his discernment. It shows Ignatius following a very rigorous structure, but oftentimes that structure doesn't provide the results that he expected that it would. And so that's helpful to us because I think maybe students to see Ignatius struggling in discernment, that Ignatius getting upset in his discernment, Ignatius becoming indignant with God, these are all things that are very human, and they can humanize Ignatian spirituality for people, and perhaps even sort of humanize their own experience of God. So I think it's an encouraging text, and I think that it's a text that can help us understand better how we can relate to God and how that relationship can be simpler than we often imagine it to be.
What role has your ability to read the original language played in your study of the diary? Because Spanish is your second language.
Right. So Taylor, it's been a great privilege for me to have learned Spanish in this society, and to have access to texts, 16th century Jesuit texts in Spanish, and specifically to have access to the diary in Ignatius's language. Though it is true that he's writing primarily in Spanish, he's also drawing from Latin and then Italian. And then to be able to read and understand as well as I think we can from the distance and the language, I think it gives us access into how he's thinking about his relationship with God. Because let's imagine this relationship with God passes through language, passes through his culture, and to get a sense of how important language was to him. For example, I have the theory, many people think that Ignatius was not a great writer, and Ignatius was not very skilled in language, but I suspect it was something very different. I suspect Ignatius was quite good in Spanish, and he was quite skilled in writing, and that he was quite good at always choosing the word that was, we might say, correct, or the word that he found most helpful for others and for him. So this is a long way of saying that Spanish has been a tremendous gift to be able to get inside of his thinking and his spirituality.
In your most recent article, which we'll leave with the notes of this interview, you talk about how the questions and frustrations that the diary provokes in the reader are actually instructive for understanding what was going on with Ignatius and the deepening of one's own spiritual experience in general. Could you say a little bit more about that, about those questions and frustrations?
Yeah. So I was giving a talk recently about the diary, and one of the a Jesuit that was at the conference expressed one of his own frustrations at reading the diary, and that clued me into the fact that when we read it, the text often provokes in us certain difficulties or tensions or frustrations. One of them is, for example, well, Ignatius, just get on with it, just make the decision. Because it seems like in the diary he knows what he wants to do, but he spends about 35 days or so waiting to make the decision. So it's my sense of that those questions are very much questions that actually draw us closer into Ignatius, and that he might have been experiencing something similar. He might have been in the tension of, well, should I just make the decision or should I just wait? And so rather than being sort of these banal or irrelevant questions to the text, I think they actually bring us closer into him, and they bring us closer into the spiritual experience itself, which is a sense of, well, should I make the decision or should I wait? Does God still have a word for me, or should I just use my freedom to move forward? So the questions actually point to these really beautiful but difficult tensions of our human relationship with God. And I think it is also to say that when we read a text, and this is a very Ignatian thing, when we read a text, we can pay close attention to what it provokes in us and allow those questions, as simple as they are, to be actually ways forward for us to think about our own spirituality, the document in front of us, or in relationship with the Lord.
In his lecture, one of the keys that Javier Meloni offers us is the psychological dimension of St. Ignatius. Among other elements, he talks about his inner wound and his desire to be seen and recognized. What do you think about this reading of Ignatius as a man?
Yeah. I mean, I think Javier has a wonderful reading. He's been doing work on the diary for many years, and I'm very familiar with his work, and I think he's onto something. At the same time, the psychological reading can often predominate in studies on the diary, so much so that we forget that the text is a spiritual text. The text is a text of his own encounter with the Lord. So though it may be the case that, say, for example, his difficulty to make a decision, his difficulty to move forward with his decision bespeaks his own inner woundedness, it may also be the case that that patience and that waiting and that allowing God to make the final word bespeaks more of his own reverence and bespeaks a part of his spirituality that we could discover, and that often a psychological reading may not allow us to discover, or the psychological reading may be so strong that we miss the spirituality that's there. So I think it's helpful. It's always helpful to have in mind all of these kinds of hermeneutical tools that we can bring to the text. We can never forget that for Ignatius, he's truly seeking God's will and God's word, and everything that he does humanly and psychologically is to find and to wait for that word.
Before we move into that topic of reverence and devotion, which is so key to your work, let's talk about the emergence of mediators who are so significant for Ignatius. Could you say a little bit about what he means by mediators and why they're so important for him?
One of the beautiful pieces of the diary is that it begins with this very slow, gradual process in which Ignatius sort of moves to the Lord to present to the Lord his discernment question, and then to allow God to respond to him. And he begins slowly. So he begins asking Our Lady for help. And then he begins asking Our Lady, who he calls the Mother, and the Son for their help. And then he says at one moment in the diary, this is perhaps day 4 or 5, where he says, I feel that the Mother and the Son have interceded for me to the Father, and have access to the Father. So it's this very reverential, gradual approach, which also tells us that Ignatius is depending on the mediators because he wants their help. This is not something that he feels he can do alone. What's really relevant or revelatory about his experience with the mediators is that they're not just passages to God the Father, but rather they are persons that are accompanying him in his process. So, for example, he has a line where he says he's hoping to be in the company of the Mother. So mediators for Ignatius bespeak something very horizontal that's taking place in his prayer, where he's imagining that his prayer and this election is happening with the help of all of these others. And I think this is something that we, in making the exercises, have an experience with, that we turn to the mediators for help, and if we're an attentive reader to the diary, we can turn to the mediators for their presence with us in our prayer as we move, like Ignatius did in the diary, closer to the Father.
Let's move into that main topic, devotion. As we see in the diary, and as Javier also tells us in his class, St. Ignatius often uses this word, accompanying it with a lot of other words. Much devotion, soft devotion, etc. Why did you decide to make this work the subject of your thesis?
Right. So much to my surprise, number one, the diary existed. I didn't know of this text. And then the second biggest surprise was Ignatius's constant turn to devotion. I had no idea that this spiritual sign, akin to consolation in the exercises, was so present to him. I had no idea that he, in an election process, which is so important to him, because it's about how the Society of Jesus will live its vow of poverty, that he would turn constantly to this one experience, which is devotion. Now, it is true that he's turning to tears. So devotion and tears function sort of in a very similar way. They're languages from God that allow him to know that God is present. But devotion, the way I read the text is, it looks like it was something so familiar to him, so credible to him, something that he was so able to recognize, that I couldn't help but think, well, maybe this would be helpful for a study on devotion. So I was intrigued by what this might have meant for him.
In your work, you make a journey through the different concepts of devotion throughout history. How is Ignatius's concept of devotion distinctive?
So his concept is distinctive in that it is allowing him to discern. So for the vast tradition, devotion is a kind of an inner experience that would signal something of God's presence. But Ignatius gives it gives it content. So for Ignatius, I think devotion is a language from God. So So it's something that's dialoguing with him about that which he has presented to God, or that which is on his mind or on his heart. So in addition, so it is more than just an experience, but it is an experience that can be interpreted. And I think that accounts for why the text is as long as it is, because devotion throughout is going to form a kind of a narrative for him that he can read and understand. So akin to consolation in the exercises, devotion is a language from God that helps him then either move forward or to know of God's presence with him.
I'm really moved when you point out that the most beautiful sign of that devotion is not when it is intense, but instead you note that Ignatius records that sometimes it lasts all day for him. Could you say a little bit about why there's such an important difference between intensity versus the duration of his devotion?
Yeah. So I think one of the ways to think about devotion in the diary is that it is a sign or a language from God on a process, a particular election that he's making. But this is also about his desire to be close to God, his desire to offer himself to God, his desire to live in God's presence. Something that he feels responsible for, so something that he can be a participant in. So when he says, I felt devotion all day, it bespeaks the kind of relationship that I think he lived with the Lord. There was a sense of this presence, intimacy, shared intimacy, in which he was throughout the day responding to God, and he found God responding to him. And my hunch is that devotion that lasted all day was probably this quiet, soft, inner sense of peace. Though it is true that Ignatius never gives a synonym for devotion, but I think we can imagine it in that way, that sort of simple relational way in which he knows the Lord is supporting him, and he knows he's participating in God's work in his life.
You make a really interesting note on the importance of devotion. If I can quote your work, you say, it appears to be the sign from God to which he attached a high degree of veracity as he sought to feel and to know the origin of all that occurred in him in his prayer. He looks for it, registers its appearance, and appears to ensure himself that the election was done well precisely because it was done in devotion. Could you say a little bit more about devotion as a confirmation in his discernment?
Yes. So it is the sign that I think he constantly looks to. It is, for example, just looking at the manuscript of the diary, he is constantly reworking the diary, he's crossing out words, he's changing words, but devotion is only crossed out once. So whenever he's writing about devotion, he's always identifying it. And then in the margins of the text, it's as if he's rereading the text, sort of reassuring himself of his process. And to reassure himself of his process, it seems to me that he writes in the margins, and this was done in devotion. So it's this experience that he knows so very well, and it's also an experience which I think it's, to put it in Javier Maloney's words, it also psychologically can calm him down. Like, I've done this, and it was with devotion, therefore I believe it's from God. I also think it's possible, this is something of a conjecture, that given the kind of familiarity that the text discloses between devotion and Ignatius, it looks like this is something that he had been familiar with for many, many years. A kind of his own language with God. It's interesting that this language, his personal language from God, doesn't appear in the exercises. Devotion is not a word in the exercises, but in his personal text, in the text where he's writing for himself about his relationship with God, this appears, and it looks to me like it was his way of being with the Lord.
When you talk about devotion in St. Ignatius's spiritual diary, it sounds an awful lot like consolation that we hear about in the spiritual exercises, but also in the autobiography. Why is Ignatius using the word devotion here in consolation? Are they the same thing?
Okay. It's helpful that you mentioned those other texts. We consider quasi-Ignatian texts, right? The autobiography is a text that wasn't written by Ignatius. And the exercise is a text that Ignatius wrote for others. Certainly the exercise is a text that comes from his experience. But I think as Ignatius, as a writer, as a good writer, is making choices on language, thinking about the people to whom it will go, right? Whereas in the diary, this is a text that is clearly for him. It was never meant to be in another person's hands. So the language in the diary is, we can say this is all of Ignatius is present, and the language is particularly his, and the language particularly important to him. So that gives us a sense of how the difference between devotion and consolation, what that difference might look like just looking at the different kinds of texts. Right? If we were to say the question might be, what is the difference between devotion and consolation, looking at devotion as it occurs in the diary, Ignatius' own text, and consolation as it occurs in a public text written by Ignatius for the church? I think we could say something very, very simple but very concrete. So where consolation in the exercises is the gift from God. It is something that really the person just receives. Right? We could say that in Spanish, de arriba. It comes to the person and moves him or her in a certain way. And it's a language that then can be interpreted to find God's will. Devotion in some ways is very similar in the diary because it's a language that will come to him from God, but devotion is also that which Ignatius can participate in. It can be that which he can do to be before God. It can also be the exercise of his promise, the gift of himself, the gift of his faithfulness to prayer. So in some ways, where consolation is just one side of the relationship, devotion in the diary is very much, as it were, so stretching the adjective here, a mutual. There's something mutual that's happening here. It's a gift that God gives to the person, and the person is also active in the relationship, giving in the relationship, offering in the relationship. And that's devotion. And I think because of that kind of mutuality, because there's agency on the part of the human person in it, I think it would have appealed to Ignatius in a really interesting ways, because it's the way for the person to use his or her freedom to offer him or herself to God. And I think that may be a helpful way to begin to think about the differences between these two texts and the differences that Ignatius may have imagined in his own personal spiritual life between devotion and consolation.
In your thesis, you argue, looking at the big picture, that God's promise of salvation is reciprocated by Ignatius with total devotion in the form of complete availability and attention to do his will, considering everything that he thinks, feels, and happens in his body is from the Lord. But we know that promises speak to us more of the future than the present. Could you say a bit about why there's a sense of incompleteness that's important in Ignatius' sense of devotion? Why he's constantly thinking of the future and God's work that's yet to be done.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting aspects of devotion is that it has kind of three different meanings. One could read the diary and find three different meanings with devotion. So on the one hand, it is his offering of himself to God. It is his completing with faithfulness his spiritual exercises. The second meaning of devotion would be that spiritual language that comes from God to him about his election process. And the third meaning, I think, is something along the lines of his experience of God's non-objective presence in his life. So he experiences God as more subject than object in his life. So devotion touches all of these three aspects, both his participation in God's, in being faithful to God, his receiving a sign from God, and then the sense that God is with him, as if God were the ground of his being. Okay? So devotion is his promise to God, and one of the things that we can see in the diary is that it's always being purified. So he's always learning how to give more of himself to God. He's always learning that his promise is always a kind of a process towards God. And similarly, he's always learning that God's promise to him in Jesus is complete. It's not dependent upon what he does or thinks or feels. Certainly God wants his faithfulness and collaboration, but God's promise to him is not dependent upon that. So he's always in the process of learning the fullness of God's promise to him, and to offer to God a fuller promise of his own.
Another important theme in the spiritual diary is the Eucharist. And when Ignatius speaks about the Eucharist, we see an image of him that's not as popular as Ignatius the Pilgrim, instead Ignatius the priest. What's the role of the Eucharist in the spiritual diary?
So the diary is in some ways, we could say it's a liturgical text almost, because to speak of tears and devotion and all of the other experiences that he registers in the diary is to speak of things that he experienced at Mass. It's interesting, the language that is most cited in the diary is language from the Roman Missal. The diary also makes clear his absolute faithfulness to the Eucharist and his sense that the Eucharist is the place of his offering of himself to God, and it is the place of communication with God. So I think this is a really beautiful frontier for us in the Society of Jesus, is to explore the way the Eucharist configured his thinking, configured his spirituality. Now it is true that Ignatian historiography has made much of the Pilgrim, which is wonderful for us, but it may also be an interesting sort of step forward in Ignatian studies to discover the way the Eucharist configured his DNA and the way the language of the Eucharist actually permeates so much of his thinking and spirituality.
Speaking of Ignatius's growth, perhaps, in his spiritual life, enormously important in his spiritual life is the role of his companions. And you seem to say that there's a role for understanding devotion as a life with his companions. You say that you would suggest that there's reason to believe that devotion occupied an even more foundational place in his spirituality. Specifically, it was what he wanted to live and what he desired his companions to live. Yeah. Could you say a little bit about the role of Ignatius's desire for devotion in the life of his companions?
Yes. So one of the texts that really should be read along with the diary, it's another autographed manuscript that we have from Ignatius, is the list of reasons for accepting the income for the sacristies of the churches, or to not accept the income. So this, he's making a discernment on a very practical question on the reception of income. Now what he also does is he writes on another document reasons why that would be beneficial and reasons why that would not be beneficial. The first reason as to why he believes the Society of Jesus should not accept this income for the churches is that a life of poverty would bring them closer to Jesus, and they would be able to live a life of greater devotion with the Lord. So if he's expressing in the context of Jesus this life of greater devotion that will bring the entire Society of Jesus closer to the Lord, closer to its mission, I think devotion becomes then an important piece for understanding both how he thought of his own relationship with the Lord, but then how he imagined the Society of Jesus living its mission with the Lord.
As we're wrapping up, a few questions about what the spiritual diary means for us Jesuits today. For your fellow Jesuits, what would you say is the role of generosity and devotion in our lives today?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things we can take away from the diary is that if we dare to ask God simple questions, if we dare to allow God into these very mundane parts of our lives, and if we spend time listening to the Lord, God's language will come. And not only will we find the answers to our questions, but as it was the case for Ignatius, we can find our very way to God. I mean, Adolfo Nicolas has this wonderful line of, if a discernment process is true, it'll bring us to the Lord. And I think Ignatius's process brought him to the Lord because he paid such close attention to this inner gift that he knew was from the Lord. And following that inner gift, he was brought to the very life of God.
And what would you say to young Jesuits in formation? I assume you would recommend us the spiritual diary, but what would you say about our approach to the diary as part of our own spiritual lives?
Absolutely. I think the diary is a charismatic source for us. So there's a life there. There's a life in these sources. For some people, it may not be the diary. It could be some letters, or it could be some constitutions, or it may be another of the early companions. But these are all great charismatic sources of life for us. And I think we personally can benefit from them. And then there's no doubt in my mind that our capacity to share these texts with others at this moment in the Church's life, in a moment of synodality, would be a great way for us to enrich that conversation and our mission.
Chris, thank you so much for our conversation today.
Thank
and
you,
blessings on your work.
Thank you very much, Taylor.